They said the trial would be fair, but from the moment she stepped onto that makeshift gallows in the dusty town square, justice had already abandoned its post. Her own people, their faces twisted into masks of righteousness and disgust, were ready to witness her humiliation, her punishment for a defiance they could not comprehend. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The whip descended with a wicked hiss, tearing through the thin fabric of her dress, leaving a crimson ribbon on her shoulder. Elizabeth, her name a forgotten whisper in the dust-choked air, did not cry out. Her defiance was a silent, searing fire, stoked by the 100 eyes fixed upon her, by the righteous fury contorting the faces of the townspeople. They called her a harlot, a witch, a blight upon their Christian settlement, all because she had dared to refuse John Hawthorne, the prosperous, pious man who held the deeds to half the valley. Her refusal wasn't born of malice, but a deeply buried, unspoken truth about his true nature, a truth too hideous for their pious ears. She stood there, bound to the rough-hewn post, her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the wooden palisade, where the endless plains stretched, untamed and indifferent to their petty judgments. Each lash was a fresh wound, not just on her flesh, but on the fragile hope she clung to, the hope that a life beyond this suffocating piety was possible. The wind, dry and relentless, whipped strands of her unbound hair across her face, mirroring the internal storm that raged within her. She was a woman adrift, marooned by circumstance and her own stubborn refusal to conform to a destiny she found abhorrent. The elder, Reverend Silas, his face a grotesque caricature of divine anger, bellowed scripture, each word a hammer, blow against her already fractured spirit. He spoke of purity, of obedience, of a woman's place beneath her husband's heel, and the crowd murmured their agreement, their self-righteousness a palpable, suffocating weight. Elizabeth tasted dust and blood, a bitter concoction that fueled her silent resolve. Her moral ambiguity, often masked by a veneer of Southern belle charm in her past, was now laid bare. A refusal to bend, a stubbornness that bordered on self-destruction, a deep-seated distrust of authority figures, born from betrayals that still haunted her dreams. The pain was real, a searing agony that threatened to consume her, yet her spirit remained unbroken, a defiant flicker in the encroaching darkness. Her eyes, wide and filled with a desperate intensity, scanned the periphery, searching for anything, any sign of intervention, even a fleeting hallucination, to escape the crushing reality of her public shaming. She was a victim, yes, but also an architect of her own fate, her refusal a desperate gamble. The second lash struck, a white-hot line across her back, and a collective gasp rose from the onlookers, a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. This was a spectacle, a warning, a reaffirmation of their rigid order. But for Elizabeth, it was merely the slow, agonizing chipping away at the last vestiges of her former life, preparing her for a transformation she could not yet foresee. She focused on a solitary hawk circling high above, a symbol of freedom she yearned for, a stark contrast to her shackled reality. The sun beat down mercilessly, a golden crucible intensifying her torment, yet she did not flinch, her gaze still fixed on the distant plains, as if drawing strength from their wildness. A third lash, sharper, more brutal, tore at her side, and a choked cry escaped her lips, quickly swallowed by the rising murmur of the crowd. The air grew thick with their collective judgment, their satisfaction almost tangible. But then a shadow fell over the scene, not from the circling hawk, but from the edge of the square. A figure, silent as the plains wind, rode into view, astride a horse as dark as night. He was a Lakota brave, his face painted with ochre and charcoal, his posture a defiant counterpoint to the rigid formality of the white settlement. The townsfolk, momentarily stunned, fell silent, their gaze shifting from the spectacle of Elizabeth's punishment to this unexpected intrusion. He wore no trappings of war, no feathers or elaborate beadwork, only deerskin and the stark simplicity of a man utterly at peace with his own formidable presence. His eyes, dark and unblinking, met Elizabeth's across the distance, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. Recognition? Pity? or simply a predator's calculated assessment. She felt a chill, not of fear, but of profound disorientation. This was not a rescue. Not in any sense she understood. This was something else entirely. A force of nature stepping into their carefully constructed drama. The elder, Reverend Silas, found his voice, a trembling, indignant sound. "Savage! What is your business here? This is a matter of our justice." The brave did not acknowledge him. His eyes remained fixed on Elizabeth, a silent question or a statement, she couldn't tell. He dismounted with an unsettling grace, his movements fluid and economical, holding the reins of his horse loosely. A tension, thick and suffocating, settled over the square, replacing the earlier outrage. The townsfolk hesitated, their usual bravado faltering in the face of this silent, imposing presence. They were men of the book, of law, of settled lands. He was a phantom, a whisper from the wild, embodying the untamed vastness they sought to conquer and contain. Elizabeth watched him, her breath catching in her throat, her chest heaving not just from the pain of the lash, but from the sudden, inexplicable shift in the air. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards her, his gaze unwavering. No threats, no grand gestures, just a quiet, implacable advance. The sheriff, a man named Brody, his face pale beneath his grizzled beard, reached for his pistol, but his hand trembled, uncertain. This was not a typical raiding party. This was a single, lone figure, a silent challenge to their authority, their very presence. The brave reached the post, his shadow falling over Elizabeth. He did not speak. He merely looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to bore into her very soul. Then, with a swift, decisive movement, he cut the ropes that bound her. The sudden release sent a jolt through her pain-racked body, and she stumbled, almost falling, but he caught her arm, his grip firm, surprisingly gentle. He did not offer comfort, no word of solace. He simply held her for a brief, bewildering moment, his presence a stark, raw contrast to the cruelty she had just endured. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath, a sudden fear blossoming in their eyes. This was not a rescue. This was an abduction. She was not saved. She was taken. He pulled her away from the post, not roughly, but with an undeniable force, her pain-racked body protesting with every step. The townspeople remained frozen, their indignation warring with a primal fear. No one moved to stop him. Perhaps it was the sheer audacity of his act, or the unspoken threat in his unwavering gaze, or simply the ingrained terror of the unknown. Elizabeth, dazed and bleeding, could only stumble along, her mind a whirling vortex of agony, confusion, and a strange, nascent glimmer of something akin to desperate hope. He led her towards his waiting horse, hoisted her onto its back with a disconcerting ease, and then mounted behind her, his powerful frame encompassing her smaller one. His silence was absolute, a profound void that offered no explanation, no comfort, no reassurance. It was simply a fact, like the relentless sun or the vast expanse of the prairie. The horse, a magnificent beast, wheeled around and galloped away, leaving the bewildered town, its stunned residents, and the lingering scent of injustice behind. As they rode, the rhythmic thud of hooves against the dry earth became a hypnotic pulse, a counterpoint to her ragged breathing. The landscape shifted from the dusty confines of the settlement to the boundless, undulating grasslands, alive with the whisper of the wind and the distant cries of unseen birds. He held her close, his arm around her waist, not in tenderness, but as a practical measure to keep her steady on the galloping horse. She felt the warmth of his skin through his deerskin tunic, the steady beat of his heart against her back, and an odd sensation bloomed within her, a strange mix of profound vulnerability and an almost liberating detachment. This was not the freedom she had dreamed of. It was a different kind of captivity, one equally unknown, equally fraught with danger, yet devoid of the judgmental stares and the suffocating morality of her past. She closed her eyes, letting the wind whip away her tears, the pain in her back a constant, dull ache. She was no longer Elizabeth, the defiant Southern belle, the woman accused of refusing her suitor. She was merely a body, transported across an alien landscape, her fate entirely in the hands of a stranger. a man from a world she had only heard whispered about in fear-laden tales. The irony was not lost on her. She had refused one captor only to be taken by another, albeit one whose intentions remained a profound mystery. Was this a mercy, a deeper punishment, or something else entirely, woven into the fabric of the untamed land itself? She had no answers, only the endless sky above and the strong, silent presence behind her. The sun dipped towards the horizon, painting the clouds in fiery hues, and the prairie stretched on, vast and indifferent. Her life, as she knew it, was irrevocably severed. She was a leaf torn from its branch, now adrift on a powerful, silent current, heading towards an unknown destiny, a destination shaped by the will of a man who spoke no words, offered no explanations, and yet, paradoxically, had offered her a grotesque form of salvation. The silence between them was profound, a chasm of cultural difference and unspoken truths, yet within that silence, a nascent curiosity, a fragile sense of wonder, began to stir in Elizabeth's bruised soul. As the last sliver of sun vanished, plunging the prairie into a sudden, deep twilight, Elizabeth felt the cold seep into her bones, a stark reminder of her exposed wounds and the profound uncertainty of her situation. His arm remained around her, a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. She allowed her mind to drift, seeking refuge in the echoes of a past life, a life that now felt impossibly distant, cloaked in the hazy veil of memory. The suitor, John Hawthorne, his image resurfaced, dark and insidious, a shadow clinging to her conscience. She saw him not as the respectable man the town revered, but as the predator she knew him to be, his piety a thin veneer over a core of unsettling darkness. She remembered his heavy-handed courtship, the way his eyes lingered on her with an unsettling possessiveness, the thinly veiled threats against her family if she resisted. Her family, a bitter taste filled her mouth. Her father, a man broken by debt and circumstance, had pushed her into the engagement, seeing it as their only salvation from ruin. He had always been weak, easily swayed by the promise of prosperity, blind to the malevolence that radiated from John Hawthorne. Her mother, a woman of brittle nerves and faded beauty, had offered only silent tears, her own spirit, long crushed by a life of disappointment. They had seen her as a commodity, a means to an end, a sacrifice to secure their dwindling legacy. This deep-seated betrayal, the feeling of being traded like chattel, fueled her defiance. It wasn't just John she rejected. It was the entire system that reduced women to property, that sanctified abuse under the guise of marriage. Her refusal was not a tantrum. It was a desperate, if ill-conceived, act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to reclaim a shred of agency in a world determined to deny her any. The memory of the whip, though fresh, felt less sharp than the sting of their betrayal, the crushing weight of their expectations. She had seen the truth in John's eyes, a cruel glint that spoke of ownership, not love. A young girl, a servant in their household years ago, had disappeared after catching John's unsolicited attention, a memory that festered in Elizabeth's mind, a dark stain that solidified her resolve. No one spoke of it, of course. Such things were swept under the rug of respectability. She knew, though, with the chilling certainty of one who had learned to read the true language of men's souls. Her defiance had not been an act of bravery, but an act of desperation, a blind lashing out against a future she could not bear. Consequences be damned. Her moral ambiguity, once a mere suggestion, had ripened into a stark refusal to play the prescribed role, regardless of the cost. The silence of the brave behind her was a strange comfort compared to the suffocating expectations of her past. It was a silence that allowed for introspection, for the slow unearthing of buried grievances, and the painful realization of her own flawed attempts at agency. The chill of the night wind felt cleansing, stripping away the layers of pretense and polite society, leaving her raw, exposed, and utterly alone, save for the silent, unknown presence at her back. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting hues of the sky and the relentless rhythm of their journey. They rode mostly in silence. The brave, whose name she still did not know, a constant, enigmatic presence. He did not speak, nor did he encourage her to speak. His communication was in gestures, in the way he offered her water from a worn skin, or shared dried meat from his pouch. She ate, driven by hunger, but tasted little. Her wounds, though painful, were meticulously tended by him each evening with poultices of crushed leaves and herbs, his touch surprisingly gentle, almost reverent, belying his stoic exterior. This careful tending of her injuries was an alien concept after the brutality she had endured, and a nascent flicker of curiosity, tinged with apprehension, began to stir within her. She observed him, covertly at first, then more openly. He moved with the effortless grace of a creature perfectly attuned to its environment, his senses sharp, his awareness encompassing everything around them. He hunted with a quiet efficiency, always providing, always watchful. He seemed to draw sustenance from the very earth, his spirit intertwined with the wildness of the plains. She saw the vastness of the sky, the endless horizon, the intricate patterns of animal tracks in the dust, things she had never truly noticed in her walled-off world. She saw his respect for the land, for the animals they hunted, a stark contrast to the colonists' ravenous consumption and exploitation. This quiet existence, devoid of judgment and societal pretense, was both terrifying and strangely liberating. There was no one to impress, no one to please, no roles to play. Her moral ambiguities, the layers of social conditioning, slowly began to peel away, exposing a raw, more essential self. She found herself watching his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the steady focus in his dark eyes, and for the first time in her life, she felt a sliver of peace, an absence of the constant societal pressure that had defined her existence. Yet, fear lingered, a cold knot in her stomach. What was her purpose here? Was she a captive, a prize, a burden? His intentions remained cloaked in the impenetrable veil of his silence. She tried a few tentative words one evening, asking his name, but he merely met her gaze, his expression unreadable, and continued sharpening a flint knife. The silence, once a chasm, began to feel less like a void and more like a space for observation, for slow, careful understanding. She learned to interpret his subtle gestures, the slight tilt of his head, the direction of his gaze, an education in a language far older and deeper than any she had known. The land, once an unknown, became a teacher, its lessons brutal, yet beautiful. The days were long, punctuated by the relentless sun and the rhythmic sway of the horse, and as the physical pain began to recede, the mental landscape of her world shifted, opening to a terrifying new reality, devoid of the familiar, yet filled with a potent, undeniable sense of wild possibility. This slow burn, this rhythmic observation, was building something, a new understanding that she couldn't yet name. One evening, as the campfire cast dancing shadows on the walls of a small rock overhang they sheltered in, the brave finally broke his silence. His voice, when it came, was low and resonant, unlike any she had heard, each word carefully chosen, almost guttural, yet imbued with a quiet power. He spoke not in English, but in his own tongue, a cascade of melodic sounds, pausing occasionally to gesture, to trace patterns in the dust, to point to the stars. He told a story, not directly to her, but seemingly to the flickering flames, a narrative woven with ancient legends and the wisdom of his people. He spoke of Wakan Tanka, the great mystery, of sacred visions, and of a prophecy. It was a tale of a white woman, lost and scarred, who would be drawn from the edges of their world by a lone warrior, not by force, but by fate. Her arrival signaling a shift, a challenge, a coming together of disparate paths. He spoke of a burden carried, a debt to be repaid, and a path forged in adversity. Elizabeth, though she understood few of the words, grasped the essence of the narrative through his gestures, the intensity in his eyes, the reverence in his tone. He was not merely telling a story, he was revealing his purpose, his justification for her abduction. He believed she was part of a prophecy, a sacred obligation, not a mere woman to be rescued or owned. The irony was a bitter twist in her gut. She had rejected the predetermined fate of a white man's wife, only to be thrust into a prophecy of a people she knew nothing about. Was this a deeper prison, or a strange, spiritual liberation? His motive, once a profound mystery, was now revealed. and it was far more complex and unsettling than anything she could have imagined. He believed she was meant to be with him, that their paths were interwoven by a force far greater than mere human will. His people, the Lakota, respected the spiritual world above all else, and for him, this act was not one of conquest but of sacred duty. He wasn't acting alone. He was acting on what he perceived as a divine imperative. The tension in her spirit, rather than dissipating, intensified. This wasn't a simple escape. It was a profound transformation. She was no longer merely Elizabeth, the defiant woman from the settlement. She was now, in his eyes, a figure of prophecy, an unwitting participant in a cosmic drama. The revelation shifted everything. Her flaws, her stubbornness, her defiance, were not seen as weaknesses but as attributes that made her the chosen one. He finished his story, his gaze finally settling on her, not with demand, but with a profound, quiet expectation. The open loop of his silence had closed, replaced by a new, more profound enigma. What role was she to play in this prophecy? What would be asked of her? The vastness of the prairie outside the rock shelter seemed to press in, pregnant with unknown destinies, and Elizabeth, for the first time, felt truly insignificant, yet profoundly, terrifyingly important. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with the weight of ancient beliefs, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that her journey had only just begun, leading her further into a world she could not comprehend, but was now irrevocably part of. The revelation of his purpose, that she was a part of some ancient prophecy, a tool of the great mystery, settled over Elizabeth like a heavy shroud. It wasn't relief she felt, but a profound sense of foreboding, a realization that her life, already fractured, was now irrevocably bound to a fate far grander and more terrifying than anything she could have conceived. Her initial fear of him, the basic instinct of a captive, began to give way to a more nuanced apprehension, a dawning awareness of the immense cultural chasm that separated them. Could she truly understand his world, his beliefs, his silent expectations? Was she merely a vessel for their spiritual aspirations? She was a woman of logic, of a God who spoke in clear, written scripture, not in prophecies woven into the very fabric of the earth. Yet there was an undeniable honesty in his eyes, a stark conviction that chipped away at her ingrained skepticism. The days that followed were marked by a subtle shift in their dynamic. He began to teach her rudimentary words in his language, gestures, the names of plants, of animals, of the cardinal directions. She, in turn, began to observe the nuances of his expressions, the subtle shifts in his posture that communicated volumes more than any spoken word. She learned that his name was Kia, meaning hawk, a fitting appellation for a man so attuned to the untamed sky. She found herself reciprocating, not out of obedience, but a curious desire to understand, to bridge the impossible gap between them. Her moral ambiguity, once a self-serving trait, began to manifest as a struggle between her ingrained prejudices against savages and the undeniable humanity she witnessed in Kia, in his quiet strength, his respect for life, his profound connection to the land. This internal conflict was sharp, often painful, forcing her to confront her own biases, the stereotypes propagated by her society. She wrestled with the dark, ugly thoughts that surfaced, remnants of a lifetime of indoctrination. But then, a new shadow appeared on their horizon, a tangible threat that eclipsed even the profound spiritual enigma. Dust plumes, faint at first, then growing steadily larger, appeared behind them, stretching across the vast plains. Kia stiffened, his eyes narrowing, his hand instinctively going to the bow slung across his back. His silence became charged, a tense coil of predatory readiness. It was the white men. She knew it, with a sickening certainty. John Hawthorne, undoubtedly, driven by his wounded pride and the perverse desire to reclaim what he believed was his. The pursuit was relentless, their figures growing clearer with each passing hour, their horses a distant, determined thunder. The relative peace of their solitary journey was shattered, replaced by an urgent, desperate flight. The unspoken questions, the cultural chasms, faded, replaced by the primal need for survival. She was no longer just Kia's sacred burden. She was also a living, breathing testament to his defiance, a prize they were determined to reclaim. The hunt was on, and she, once the hunted in a metaphorical sense, was now literally running for her life, alongside a man who had taken her without a word, a man who, paradoxically, was now her only shield against the world she had fled. The chase was relentless, a grueling test of endurance that blurred the lines between day and night, hope and despair. Kia pushed his horse, and hers, to their limits, his gaze perpetually scanning the horizon, his movements tense, alert. Elizabeth, despite her lingering pain and weariness, found a reserve of strength she never knew she possessed. The immediate threat, the thunder of hooves behind them, overshadowed every other concern. All the cultural differences, the spiritual prophecies, the complex emotional baggage were stripped away, leaving only the stark reality of survival. They were two beings, one pursuing, one pursued, bound by the unforgiving laws of the wild. John Hawthorne and his men, identifiable now by their precise formations and the glint of their rifles, were gaining. Their pursuit was not just about retrieving Elizabeth. It was about asserting dominance, about reclaiming a stolen symbol of their patriarchal order. They shouted, their voices faint but menacing, carried on the wind. "Harlot! Savage!" Their words were like venomous darts, intended to break their spirit, but they only served to solidify an unexpected bond between Elizabeth and Kia. In these desperate hours, a silent understanding deepened between them. Kia, usually so stoic, would occasionally glance back at her, a fleeting look that conveyed concern, vigilance, and perhaps a grudging respect for her resilience. She, in turn, found herself trusting him implicitly, her life literally in his hands. There was no room for doubt, no space for the old prejudices. He was protector, guide, and companion in this terrifying ordeal. The landscape became their ally and their enemy. Vast plains offering no cover, then sudden canyons promising ambush, rocky outcrops providing temporary respite. They rode through storms that lashed them with rain and wind, and under a sun that baked the earth hard. One afternoon, as they crossed a narrow, treacherous ridge, one of Hawthorne's men fired, the bullet whistling dangerously close to Elizabeth's head. Kia reacted instantly, pulling her down, shielding her with his body as the horse plunged forward. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a raw, protective instinct that transcended language and culture. For a fleeting second, pressed against his back, she felt the powerful rhythm of his heart, the scent of earth and deerskin, and knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he would die to protect her. The shared ordeal was a crucible, burning away the dross of her former life, forging a new connection. She was no longer a victim. She was a participant, an active survivor alongside him. Her moral ambiguities, once so convoluted, simplified into a singular, desperate will to live, and to help him live. The irony was almost unbearable. She had fled one life of servitude to be enslaved by a prophecy, only to find true, terrifying freedom in a shared, desperate fight for existence with the very man who had initially taken her against her will. The chase was relentless, but so was their silent resolve. The chase culminated in a tense standoff at the edge of a deep ravine, its sheer drop plunging into a churning river far below. Hawthorne and his men, exhausted but triumphant, had finally cornered them. The air thrummed with a dangerous stillness, broken only by the panting of horses and the ragged breaths of the men. John Hawthorne, his face contorted by a mixture of rage and twisted satisfaction, dismounted. "Elizabeth," he bellowed, his voice raw, "come back to where you belong. Back to your senses, girl." His words were a last, desperate attempt to reclaim what he saw as his property, his wounded pride echoing across the canyon. Kia stood poised, his bow drawn, an arrow nocked, his eyes fixed on Hawthorne, utterly fearless. He stood between Elizabeth and her past, a silent, unyielding bulwark. The moment hung suspended, a tableau of opposing worlds, centuries of conflict distilled into a singular, breathless instant. Elizabeth, her heart pounding, felt a profound clarity descend upon her. The choice was not merely between two men, but between two worlds, two destinies. The one she had fled, defined by hypocrisy, subjugation, and a spiritual emptiness that masqueraded as piety, and the one she had stumbled into, chaotic, dangerous, yet imbued with a raw honesty, a profound connection to the earth, and an enigmatic prophecy that now felt less like a burden and more like a strange, wild invitation. She looked at Kia. His face grim, his focus absolute. There was no demand in his eyes, only a quiet acceptance of whatever choice she made. This was his profound offer of freedom, not in words, but in the stark reality of their shared peril. This was the pivotal, emotional climax. She could try to return, to beg for mercy, to re-enter a life of false respectability, or she could stand with the man who had shown her a different path, a path forged in pain and mystery, but also in an undeniable, fierce dignity. The memory of the whip, the judgment, the betrayal, flashed in her mind. The servant girl who had disappeared. The truth of John Hawthorne, cloaked in his pious veneer. The choice was clear. No, her voice, though hoarse, rang out, clear and defiant across the ravine, a sound that shocked both sides. "I will not return!" John Hawthorne's face contorted further in disbelief and rage. "You choose a savage over your own kind? Over God?" he roared, raising his rifle. Kia, without a word, released the arrow. It flew true, striking the ground mere inches from Hawthorne's foot. A warning, not a kill. The message was clear. She was under his protection, and he would not yield. The tension snapped. Hawthorne's men hesitated, their own fear of the skilled warrior overriding their orders. Kia, seeing their faltering resolve, let out a piercing cry, a guttural sound that echoed across the canyon. A final, primal warning. It was a bluff, a gamble, but it worked. With an oath, Hawthorne turned, his fury burning, but he and his men retreated, their horses churning up dust as they rode away, defeated. Elizabeth watched them go, not with triumph, but with a quiet understanding. Her past, her tormentors, were gone. She was finally free, but her freedom was not a return to innocence. It was a leap into the profound unknown, into a life utterly reshaped by a dramatic choice, a testament to her profound transformation. The dust settled slowly, lingering like a ghost over the ravine. Elizabeth stood there, the silence profound, almost sacred, after the thunderous departure of Hawthorne's men. Kia lowered his bow, his gaze sweeping the horizon, ensuring their safety. He then turned to her, his dark eyes holding a question, a silent invitation, a profound sense of shared understanding. There was no triumph in his demeanor, no pride in his victory, only a quiet acceptance of the path they had chosen, together. The tension that had coiled within her for so long began to unravel, replaced by a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilarating possibility. She was no longer running from something. She was moving towards something. Though its form was still undefined, her choice, made in the crucible of absolute peril, had solidified her moral landscape. The superficial piety of her old world, once a prison, now seemed a distant, hollow echo. Her flaws, her stubbornness, her defiance, her refusal to be molded, had, ironically, become the very qualities that allowed her to break free. She looked at Kia, this man who had taken her without a word, rescued her without a thought for recompense, and offered her a silent, profound freedom. He was not a traditional hero, and she was certainly not a damsel in distress in the conventional sense. Their connection was forged in the fires of survival, of shared adversity, and a mystical purpose she was only beginning to grasp. The journey continued, but it was no longer a flight. It was a passage into a new life, a slow, grounded integration into Kia's world. She learned his language, his ways, his respect for the land, finding beauty in the stark simplicity, profound meaning in the ancient rituals. The dark emotional tone of her captivity gradually lightened, replaced by a nascent, hopeful resolution. Not a naive, fairy tale hope, but a hard-won, grounded hope born from survival and self-discovery. There were still open loops, still mysteries to unravel. The full extent of the prophecy, her role within the Lakota community, the inevitable challenges of bridging two vastly different worlds, these remained. But she faced them with a quiet determination, no longer fearing the unknown, but embracing it as her new reality. She carried the scars, both physical and emotional, from the whip and the betrayal, reminders of the life she had escaped, symbols of the painful crucible through which she had passed. But she also carried a new strength, a deeper understanding of herself, and a profound respect for the silent brave who had dared to disrupt her world and offer her a terrifying, glorious freedom. Her journey was far from over, but the path ahead, though fraught with uncertainty, was now undeniably her own, shared with a man whose silence spoke volumes, and whose presence promised a future built not on societal expectation, but on the raw, wild truth of existence. The sun, a golden orb in the vast blue sky, seemed to shine with a new warmth upon her, a silent blessing on her strange, unexpected odyssey.